The air in the co-op office hung thick with the smell of seed corn dust, stale coffee, and the faint, sharp tang of anhydrous ammonia from the tanks out back. It was early April 1975. The frost was finally letting go of the black Iowa soil, and a man could feel the anxious energy buzzing through the county. Arthur Miller stood at the counter, his knuckles stained with grease that no amount of Boraxo soap could ever fully scrub away. He was waiting on a set of injector seals for the Cummins 555 in his old Steiger. A simple part, but one that could mean the difference between getting his corn in on time or watching the season pass him by. The door swung open, letting in a slice of bright, cold sunlight and Dale Peterson. Dale didn't just walk into a room, he filled it. He was 10 years younger than Art, with a broad, confident smile and hands that had never seen the inside of a stubborn differential. He was wearing a brand-new seed corn cap, the bill still perfectly curved, and a clean pair of jeans. He clapped Art on the shoulder a little too hard. "Art, still trying to piece that old green monster back together?" Dale boomed, his voice echoing off the plywood walls. A couple of other farmers leaning against a rack of oil filters chuckled. Art just gave a slow nod. "She needs a few things before I turn her loose." "A few things?" Dale laughed, a big theatrical sound. "I saw her sitting in your yard yesterday. Looked like you were performing surgery with a cutting torch. You know, Art, for what you spend on parts and your own time, you could make the payments on a new machine. A real machine." Just then, the rumble of a big diesel engine vibrated through the floorboards. Dale grinned and pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the window. Parked out front, gleaming in the sun, was a brand-new John Deere 4640. Its green paint was so deep you could fall into it. The tires were still showing the little rubber nubs from the factory mold, and the cab was a palace of glass and air conditioning. "Just picked her up from the dealer," Dale announced to the room. "Thompson over at the bank says a man's got to leverage his assets to grow. Says you can't make money with old iron sitting in the shed." Art looked from the shiny new Deere back to Dale's expectant face. He didn't feel envy. He didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet, settled stillness, the kind of feeling you get when you own something, truly own it, down to the last bolt. "That Steiger," Art said, his voice low and even, "is mine. Every last washer. When I turn the key, the only man I owe anything to is myself. Can you say the same about that one?" Dale's smile tightened at the edges. "That's old-timer talk, Art. This is 1975. The game has changed. Get big or get out. President Ford, Earl Butts, they're all saying it. Plant fence row to fence row. The world is hungry, and the bank is happy to help a man who's not afraid to take a risk." The man behind the counter slid a small paper bag across to Art. "Here's your seals, Art." Art paid the man with a few worn bills from his wallet, the total coming to less than $5. He nodded at Dale. "Good luck with your payments." He walked out past the new John Deere, the smell of its fresh paint and hot, new rubber filling the air. It was a beautiful machine, no doubt. But as he climbed into his old, dented 1968 Ford F-250, the one with the primer spot on the driver's side fender and a seat patched with duct tape, he felt a different kind of wealth. He turned the key, and the big 390 V8 rumbled to life with a familiar throaty cough. It was his. The truck was his. The 320 acres his father had homesteaded were his, and the giant, ugly, powerful Steiger Bearcat II sitting in his machine shed, that was his too. That Steiger was a brute. Art had bought it used 3 years prior after a surprisingly good soybean crop. It was a 1970 model, one of the early articulated four-wheel drives that had started showing up in the Dakotas and were now finding their way into the Corn Belt. It wasn't sleek like the new Deeres or Cases. It was built out of thick plates of steel welded together in Fargo, North Dakota, with function winning over form every single time. The paint was a faded industrial green, chipped and scarred from years of hard work. The cab was little more than a metal box with glass, and the only air conditioning was opening a window. But at its heart was a triple nickel, a 5.55 cubic inch Cummins V8 diesel engine that put out a deep guttural roar when you put it under load. It was a simple, powerful machine built for one thing, pulling. And Art had paid cash for it. He'd drained his savings account and handed a man a bank check for $12,000. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Dale Peterson told everyone Art could have used that as a down payment on a machine worth 3 times as much. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand the peace of mind that came with a clear title tucked away in a safe deposit box. They didn't understand the freedom of not waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, wondering how you were going to make a $4,000 payment if the rains didn't come. Now, before we get too deep into the grease and the grain prices, I gotta ask you folks listening, have you ever owned something, a tool or a truck, that wasn't the newest or the fanciest, but it was yours, free and clear? Maybe it was an old Craftsman toolbox your grandfather gave you, or a first car you paid for with money from a summer job. Did you feel that quiet pride every time you turned the key or opened that lid? That deep down satisfaction that no bank or lender could ever touch? Let me know down in the comments, because that's the feeling Art Miller lived by. It was the bedrock of his whole world, and in the years to come, it was a foundation that would be tested by forces he couldn't yet imagine. Back in his shop, Art laid the new injector seals out on a clean red rag. The shop was his sanctuary. It was an old wooden building, the timbers dark with a half-century of oil and sweat. The air smelled of cold steel, cutting fluid, and the faint aroma of the wood stove in the corner. Tools hung in their proper places on the pegboard walls, wrenches and sockets arranged by size, their chrome finish worn to a dull silver from years of use. This was where he kept the farm alive. While Dale Peterson was writing checks to the John Deere dealership's service department, Art was here, with his own 2 hands, learning the intimate language of his machines. He spent the rest of the afternoon hunched over the big Cummins engine. The hood of the Steiger was tilted forward, exposing the massive V8. It was a tight fit, working around the fuel lines and linkages. His hands, though strong, felt clumsy as he tried to work the tiny rubber seals into their grooves. He dropped one, and it fell down into the dark, greasy maze of the engine block. He let out a long, slow breath, the frustration a hot knot in his chest. He spent the next 20 minutes with a magnet on a flexible wand, patiently fishing for the lost seal. This was the part of farming Dale and the others never saw. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't glorious. It was tedious, frustrating work done alone in a dusty shop while the sun was shining and the fields were waiting. By the time he finished, dusk was painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. He wiped his hands, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The engine hesitated for a moment, then caught with a belch of black smoke that billowed out of the straight chrome stack. The deep, rhythmic rumble of the V8 filled the shed, a sound of pure, unadulterated power. Art let it warm up, his eyes on the oil pressure gauge, watching the needle climb to a healthy 60 psi. A small smile touched his lips. He had done it. He had fixed it. The cost was $5 in parts and a day of his time. He knew what the dealership would have charged Dale for a similar job on his 4640. It would have been a bill with at least 2 zeros at the end of it. The next morning, Art was in the field. The Steiger pulled the 24-foot field cultivator with ease, its 4 big tires biting into the damp earth. The sound of the Cummins echoed across the section, a defiant roar against the quiet spring morning. He could see Dale's new John Deere working in the field to the north, a bright green speck moving with impressive speed. But Art wasn't in a race. He was farming. He set his throttle, watched the black soil curl away from the shanks of the cultivator, and settled in for the long day ahead. The spring of '75 bled into summer. The corn grew tall and green, a testament to good seed and timely rains. But Art's fields had a few uneven spots, patches where the corn was a week behind the rest. It was the price he'd paid for the days spent in the shop. At the grain elevator, the talk was all about Dale Peterson. He'd finished planting a full week before anyone else. His corn was picture perfect, a uniform sea of green from fence row to fence row. That Dale, he's really going to town, one of the older farmers, a man named Henderson, remarked to Art as they waited to unload a small batch of oats. Got that new planter with the liquid fertilizer tanks on it. Says it gives the corn a jump start. Art just nodded. He's covering a lot of ground. You know, Henderson said, lowering his voice a little, Thompson down at the bank was in the diner yesterday. Said he wishes he had 100 more customers like Dale. Said Dale understands the future of farming. He used that word again. Leverage. The word left a sour taste in Art's mouth. Leverage. It sounded like a fancy term for being in debt up to your eyeballs. It sounded like letting a man in a suit and tie have a say in how you ran your own farm. That summer, Mr. Thompson himself paid a visit. He pulled up in his shiny Buick Electra, the tires crunching on Art's gravel driveway. He got out, smoothing his tie and looking around with a critical eye. He saw the old Farmall M parked by the barn, its red paint faded to a dull orange. He saw the solid but unpainted wooden corn crib. He saw the Steiger, now dusty from fieldwork, sitting by the machine shed. "Arthur," Thompson said, his voice smooth as cream. "Good to see you. Just making my rounds, checking in on our clients." "I'm not your client, Mr. Thompson," Art said, not unkindly. "The farm's been paid off for 2 years now." Thompson gave a little chuckle. Of course, a figure of speech. But that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. You're sitting on a gold mine here, Art. This land, free and clear, it's a powerful asset. Land values have gone up 30% in the last year alone. You could borrow against it, expand your operation. Buy that quarter section next to you that's coming up for sale. Get yourself some new equipment. A man can't stand still, Art. You're either growing or you're dying. He gestured toward the Steiger. That machine, for example. It's a good old horse, I'm sure, but it's outdated. Think of the efficiency you'd gain with a new tractor. Better fuel economy, less downtime, a comfortable cab so you can work longer hours. This one works just fine, Art said, his gaze steady. And I don't have to worry about downtime when it's in the dealership shop for a week waiting on a computer part from Moline. Thompson's smile faltered for a second. Look, Art, I'm trying to help you. Dale Peterson came to me 2 years ago with a vision. Now he's farming nearly 1,000 acres. His net worth has tripled. He's a success story. You could be too. All it takes is a signature. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thompson, Art said, turning to walk back toward his shop. But I like to sleep at night. He left the banker standing in the driveway next to his Buick. As Art entered the cool darkness of the shop, he could hear the crunch of gravel as the car turned around and headed back to town. The conversation left him with a sense of unease. It felt like the whole world was moving in a direction he didn't want to go, a world of easy credit and ever-increasing debt. He looked at the Steiger, at its simple, heavy-duty frame and its powerful mechanical engine. It was a relic from a different way of thinking. It was a tool, not an asset to be leveraged. It was a partner in the work, not a liability on a balance sheet. And for now, that was enough. The next few years seemed to prove Dale Peterson and the banker right. The mid to late 1970s were a boom time for American agriculture. The Great Russian Grain Deal had opened up a massive new market, and grain prices shot to levels no one had ever seen before. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Soybeans were pushing $7. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $2,000 and then $3. It was a gold rush, and farmers were caught in the frenzy. Dale Peterson was the king of the county. He bought the quarter section next to Art, financing it with a loan from Mr. Thompson at what seemed like a reasonable 8% interest. The next year, he bought another 300 acres on the other side of the road. To work all this new ground, he traded in the 4640. He didn't just get a bigger tractor, he got one of the biggest tractors John Deere made. A brand new 8630, it was an articulated four-wheel drive, just like Art's Steiger, but it was a different breed entirely. It was sleek, with a comfortable, quiet sound guard body cab, air conditioning, and a tape deck. It had more horsepower, more hydraulic power, more everything. When Dale drove it home from the dealership, he made a point of going past Art's farm. He saw Art out in the yard, working on a fence, and he gave a long blast of the air horn. The sound was deep and powerful, the horn of a locomotive, and it echoed across the valley. Art just stopped his work, leaned on a fence post, and watched the massive green machine roll by, its dual tires on all four corners making it nearly as wide as the road. It was a symbol of the new age of farming, and it made his old Steiger look like a relic from a museum. Dale didn't stop there. He put up 2 massive new grain bins with automatic augers and drying fans. He built a new insulated machine shed, a steel palace that dwarfed Art's old wooden barn. He bought a new 6-row corn combine, then traded it for an 8-row machine the following year. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and they took a vacation to Hawaii that winter. At the co-op, at the diner, at church, Dale was held up as the example of what a smart, aggressive young farmer could achieve. And Art Miller, he was seen as a failure. A man stuck in the past, too timid to seize the opportunity that was right in front of him. He had good years too. The high grain prices meant he was making more money than he ever had. But he didn't behave like the others. He didn't rush to the bank to borrow against his good fortune. The first thing he did was pay off the last of the mortgage his father had taken out 20 years before. The day he walked out of Mr. Thompson's bank with the paid-in-full deed in his hand, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. With the extra money from the good harvests, he didn't buy more land. He didn't buy a new tractor. He systematically improved what he already had. He put a new steel roof on the barn. He rewired the house. He bought a brand new set of 24.532 tires for the Steiger, a purchase that cost him nearly $4,000, but he paid for it with a single check. The largest check he wrote, however, was to himself. He took the profits and put them into certificates of deposit at the bank. 6-month CDs, 1-year CDs, earning 5, then 6% interest. It was safe, it was solid. Dale found this endlessly amusing. He ran into Art at the parts counter one day. Art was buying a new set of filters for the Steiger. Dale, who had just signed the papers on another 80 acres, clapped him on the back. "Heard you paid off the old homestead, Art. Congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Now you can finally start farming for real. What's your next move? You gonna buy that little 80 acres south of you?" "No, I don't think so," Art said quietly. "I've got enough to handle as it is." "Enough to handle?" Dale laughed. "Art, the money is practically free right now. Thompson will give you whatever you want. You're sitting on a pile of gold and treating it like it's a pile of rocks. Still saving for a rainy day, you old fool. It's pouring money right now." Art just picked up his filters. "Rains don't last forever, Dale." He walked away, leaving Dale shaking his head and chuckling with the parts man. The label stuck. In the coffee shops and the sale barns, he became Rainy Day Art, the man who was too scared to get rich. He was an oddity, a throwback. His neighbors would drive by and see him on his old Steiger, pulling his old equipment, and they'd shake their heads with a mixture of pity and scorn. They didn't see the new roof on the barn or the solid fence lines. They saw a man being left behind by progress. Art felt the isolation, but it didn't change his course. He trusted the lessons his father had taught him. Owe no man. Fix what is broken. Respect the land. Live within your means. These were simple rules, rules that seemed hopelessly out of date in the booming late 1970s. As the decade began to draw to a close, the first faint clouds appeared on the horizon. They were small at first, easy to ignore. A news report on the radio in Art's shop, tucked between a country song and an ad for livestock feed. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking about something called the prime interest rate. He mentioned a name Art had never heard before, Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The man was on a crusade, the reporter said, a crusade to whip inflation now. Interest rates, which had been stable for years, had started to twitch upwards. 8% became 9, then 10. One evening in the late fall of 1979, Art was in his machine shed, doing his end-of-season maintenance on the Steiger. He was changing the oil, the big Cummins holding nearly 10 gallons. The smell of the used diesel oil was heavy in the air. He had the radio on, the signal crackling with static. Through the big open door of the shed, he could see across the valley. The lights of Dale Peterson's new 8-row combine were still moving across a distant hillside, gobbling up the last of his soybeans. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Dale had been running like that for weeks, pushing himself and his equipment to the limit to get his massive crop in. The radio announcer's voice cut through the music. And in financial news, the Federal Reserve today raised its key lending rate a full percentage point in a continuing effort to combat runaway inflation. The prime rate is now expected to climb past 12%, a post-war record. Art stopped, the heavy oil filter wrench in his hand. 12%. He did the math in his head. Dale had hundreds of thousands of dollars in operating loans and mortgages. His interest payments were about to skyrocket. A cold wind blew into the shed, rattling a loose piece of tin on the roof. It carried the smell of rain and dying leaves. Art looked out at the distant lights of Dale's combine, a small, frantic beacon in the vast darkness. Then he looked down at his own hands, covered in the grease from his own machine. The Giant Steiger sat quiet under the bare light bulb, its engine cold. It wasn't an asset. It wasn't a liability. It was just a tractor, paid for, ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Art Miller felt a deep, chilling premonition that the rain Dale had been laughing about for so long was finally on its way. The year 1980 dawned not with a bang, but with a tightening, a slow, inexorable squeeze that every farmer in the county could feel in his bones. It started on the radio. The news was no longer about booming exports and record prices. It was about hostages in Iran and a Soviet invasion of a country called Afghanistan. Then came the announcement that hit like a physical blow, a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The market that had fueled the boom of the 70s vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $3.50, fell to $2.50 and then kept falling. At the co-op, the confident swagger was gone. Men stood in small, quiet groups, their faces etched with worry. The talk was of operating loans, of notes coming due. And the other number, the one that haunted their sleep, was the prime interest rate. It had climbed past 15%, then 18%. Mr. Thompson, the banker, no longer made friendly visits to farms. Now his letters arrived in crisp, white envelopes, the language polite but the message clear. Payments were due, and the new, higher variable interest rates were now in effect. Dale Peterson felt the squeeze more than anyone. He was leveraged to the hilt, with mortgages on over 1,000 acres and massive equipment loans, all tied to that terrifying variable rate. The interest on his debt was now a monster that devoured every dollar he made and then demanded more. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, haunted frown. His new seed corn cap was battered and stained with grease and sweat. That spring, the sky turned against them too. The rain stopped in May. The days grew hot and windy, the sun beating down from a hazy, merciless sky. The topsoil turned to powder, blowing in great brown clouds that buried fence lines and coated every surface with a fine layer of grit. The young corn, which had sprouted so hopefully, began to curl its leaves, turning a sickly pale green. It was a cry for water that went unanswered. Art felt the pressure too. The low prices and the dry weather hurt him just like everyone else. But his pain was a dull ache, not a mortal wound. His land was paid for, his machinery was his. His only major operating cost was fuel and seed, which he paid for with cash from the sale of the previous year's crop. While his neighbors were paying 20% interest on their operating loans, Art was earning 12% on the CDs he had tucked away. The rainy day he'd been saving for had arrived, and it was a drought. One brutally hot afternoon in July, Art was cultivating his soybeans, trying to break up the crusty soil to conserve what little moisture was left. He was on his old Farmall M, a tractor his father had bought new in 1951. It was slow, noisy, and had no cab, but it sipped fuel and was as reliable as the sunrise. As he reached the end of a row, he saw a cloud of dust on the road. It was Dale, driving his pickup way too fast. He skidded to a stop next to the fence line. Art shut down the old tractor, the silence ringing in his ears. Dale got out, his face flushed and his eyes wild. "Art, you gotta help me." "What's wrong, Dale?" "It's the 8630. She just quit, dead in the middle of the field. I was trying to cultivate just like you. The engine's running, but she won't move. Something about the transmission." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of grime. "The dealership says they can't get a man out here for 3 days, and it'll be $150 just for the service call. I can't afford that right now, Art. I can't." The desperation in his voice was raw. This was the man who had mocked Art's old Steiger, the man who had embodied the new age of farming. Now he was broken by the very complexity he had celebrated. "I don't know much about those new ones, Dale," Art said honestly. They're full of electronics and solenoids, not like the old ones. But you're good with this stuff, Dale pleaded. Everybody knows it. Can you just take a look? Art drove with him over to Dale's field. The massive John Deere 8630 sat silent in the stunted corn, a monument to a broken dream. Its green paint was dull with dust, its huge dual tires sinking into the powdery soil. Art climbed into the pristine Sound Guard cab. It was like the cockpit of an airplane compared to his Steiger. He turned the key. The big six-cylinder diesel fired right up, smooth and quiet. But when he moved the shift lever, nothing happened. A small red light blinked on the console. Art spent an hour looking it over. He checked the fluid levels, the linkages. He couldn't find anything obviously wrong. It was something deep inside, something hidden behind a wall of wires and hydraulic lines, something that could only be diagnosed with special tools and a service manual the size of a phone book. "I'm sorry, Dale," Art said, climbing down from the cab. "It's beyond me. You're going to have to call the dealer." Dale slumped against one of the giant tires, the fight going out of him. He looked out over his drought-stricken fields at the magnificent, useless machine that was supposed to be his ticket to prosperity. 3 days, he whispered. By then, it won't matter anyway. As Art drove home, he passed his own north field. The Steiger was parked where he'd left it after finishing his spring tillage, its faded green paint looking dull and tired in the harsh sunlight. It looked like a simple, crude beast next to Dale's sophisticated machine. But Art knew that if the Steiger's transmission failed, he could pull it apart himself on his shop floor. It was a mess of gears and bearings and shafts, but it was all mechanical. He could understand it. He could fix it. And in a world that was spinning out of control, that simple fact was a rock he could stand on. The first cracks in Dale Peterson's empire weren't financial. They were hydraulic. They were electrical. They were the cracks of complexity, the penalty for surrendering self-reliance for the promise of push-button efficiency. The drought broke in late July with a series of violent thunderstorms, but it was too little, too late. The harvest of 1981 was a disaster. Yields were down by a third across the county. Combined with the rock-bottom prices, it was a knockout blow for farmers who were already on the ropes. The whispers in the co-op turned into grim, open speculation about who would be the first to go under. The auction notices started appearing in the county paper that winter. At first, it was just a few small operators, men on the fringes. Then, in the spring of 1982, the big one hit. It was a full-page ad, with the stark black heading, "Foreclosure Auction, Dale and Sandra Peterson." The list of assets was staggering, the 1,000-plus acres of prime farmland listed parcel by parcel, the John Deere 8630, the 8-row combine, the grain bins, the new machine shed, the Lincoln Continental, even the house, the one they had built just 5 years earlier. It was a public dissection of a man's life, laid out in cold, hard type for the whole county to see. Art saw Dale a few days before the sale. He was at the gas station, putting $5 worth of gas into a rusty, beat-up old pickup he must have borrowed from a relative. He looked like a ghost. He had lost weight, and his eyes were hollow. He saw Art, and for a moment he looked like he was going to turn away in shame. But he didn't. He just stood there, holding the gas nozzle, the fight completely gone. "Heard you're doing all right, Art," Dale said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Art just nodded. There was nothing to say. "You were right," Dale continued, looking down at his worn-out boots. "All those years, I thought you were a fool. An old-timer, afraid of progress. But you weren't afraid. You were smart. That Steiger, that damn ugly old tractor, you own it. Thompson can't touch it. He can't touch your land. You sleep at night, don't you, Art?" "I do," Art said quietly. "I haven't slept in 2 years," Dale said. He finished pumping the gas and hung up the nozzle. He didn't look at Art as he got back in the truck. "I'll see you at the sale, I guess. Somebody's got to watch them give away my life." The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a raw November wind that whipped across the farmyard. The yard was packed with trucks and cars. Farmers from 3 counties had come, not just to look for bargains, but to witness the spectacle, to see the fall of the man who had flown higher than any of them. It was a grim, somber affair. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim, knowing that with a few bad breaks, this could be them. The auctioneers, a fast-talking team from the city, started with the small tools and shop equipment. Everything sold for pennies on the dollar. There was no money in the county, no one was buying. Dale and his wife, Sandy, stood by the porch of their house, watching in silence. Sandy was crying quietly, her face buried in her husband's shoulder. Dale just stared straight ahead, his expression blank, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. Mr. Thompson, the banker, was there, looking uncomfortable in his expensive overcoat. He stood with a clipboard, keeping a running tally, his face a mask of professional detachment. But Art could see the strain around his eyes. The bank wasn't winning here. They were taking a bath, recovering only a fraction of what they had loaned out. They sold the big machinery. The gleaming John Deere 8630, with less than 1,000 hours on it, sold for less than half of what Dale had paid. The combine went for even less. It was a bloodbath. Art didn't bid on any of it. He didn't need it, and he wasn't there to pick over the bones of his neighbor. Art survived because his foundation was solid rock, not shifting sand. While Dale was paying 20% on his loans, Art's CDs were paying him double digits. That interest income, small as it was, covered his property taxes and living expenses. He didn't need to sell a single bushel of his meager 1981 crop at the bottom of the market. He stored it all in his old wooden corn crib and his small grain bin, both paid for decades ago. He waited. His old Steiger, which had seemed like such a liability, was now his greatest asset. When a hydraulic pump seal failed that spring, he didn't call a dealer. He drove to the industrial supply store in town, matched the seal for $3, and spent an afternoon in his shop installing it himself. The total cost of the repair was less than a tank of fuel. He was an island of stability in a sea of financial ruin, protected by the simple, powerful armor of owning what he had and knowing how to fix it. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the main event: the land. He started with the parcels Dale had bought last, the ones with the biggest mortgages. They sold for a pittance, barely enough to cover the legal fees. The crowd thinned out. The grim reality was setting in. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, now for the home place, 160 acres, with house, barn, and improvements. The original Peterson family homestead. This was the heart of it all, the land Dale's grandfather had broken with a team of horses. A silence fell over the remaining crowd. This felt different. This was sacred ground. The bidding started low, insultingly low. A speculator from the city made a bid. Another farmer, feeling opportunistic, raised it slightly. Mr. Thompson looked increasingly nervous. The bids were stalling at a level that wouldn't even cover half the mortgage. Dale closed his eyes. He couldn't watch. Sandy sobbed openly now, and then a new voice cut through the cold air, a calm, steady voice. $100,000, Art Miller said. Every head turned to look at him. He was standing near the back, by his old Ford pickup, his hands in his pockets. He hadn't said a word all day. The bid was a huge jump, more than $30,000 over the last one. It was a real number. The speculator from the city shook his head and walked away. The other farmer dropped out. The auctioneer looked at Art, then at the crowd. $100,000. Do I hear 110? 100,000 once. Twice. He looked at Mr. Thompson. The banker gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He knew this was the best he was going to get. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking in the cold air. For $100,000 to Art Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. Rainy Day Art, the man who never spent a dime, had just bought the Peterson homestead. Dale opened his eyes, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. Art walked over to the auctioneer's table and signed the papers. He didn't write a check from a bank loan. He handed the clerk a cashier's check. It was the money from his certificates of deposit, the money he had so patiently saved during the good years. Then he did something no one expected. He walked over to Dale. He didn't gloat. He didn't preach. He just stood in front of his broken neighbor and held out a set of keys. They were the keys to the house. "Dale," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "this is your home. It was your father's home and your grandfather's home. It should stay that way. You and Sandy are going to live here. You're going to farm this quarter section. You're going to pay me cash rent, whatever you can afford, when you can afford it. And one day, if you want, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. No interest. Dale stared at the keys, then at Art's face, searching for some trick, some angle. He found none. He saw only a quiet sincerity. Tears welled up in his eyes, tears of shame, of gratitude, of overwhelming relief. He couldn't speak. He just took the keys and nodded, his whole body shaking. The story of what happened at the Peterson auction spread through the county like wildfire. In the diner, at the elevator, over the party line phones, the narrative changed. Art Miller was no longer rainy day Art, the timid fool. He was steady Art, the man who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was blinded by the sun. He became a legend, not for getting rich, but for surviving with his dignity and his farm intact, and for showing compassion when he had every right to show contempt. The 1980s were lean years. Art farmed his own ground and the 160 acres he'd bought. Dale became his hired man, working for a wage, slowly rebuilding his life. The two men, once rivals, formed a quiet partnership. They worked side by side, Art often teaching Dale the old skills: how to weld a broken spindle, how to time an old diesel engine, how to make do and get by. The gleaming new machine shed on Dale's old place now housed Art's ancient Steiger and Farmall M, alongside Dale's borrowed pickup. The irony was lost on no one. Years passed, the farm economy slowly recovered. Art's son, young Tom, grew up and decided he wanted to farm. Art didn't send him to the bank for a loan. He taught him in the shop. He taught him the difference between an asset and a liability. He taught him that true wealth wasn't measured by the size of your tractor, but by the lack of names on your deed. One crisp autumn evening in the late 1980s, Art and a teenage Tom were in the shop, giving the old Steiger its end-of-season service. The tractor was nearly 20 years old now, its paint almost completely gone in places, its steel scarred and dented. But its heart, the big Cummins V8, was as strong as ever. "Dad," Tom asked, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag, "why don't we get a new tractor? All my friends' dads have new ones, with computers and GPS and everything." Art stopped turning his wrench and looked at his son. He walked over to a dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the shop. He pulled out a thick envelope, and from it he took a piece of paper, the original deed to the farm, signed by his own grandfather. Then he took out another, the paid-in-full deed to the Peterson place. "This," Art said, tapping the papers, "is why. These mean it's ours. Not the bank's, not the government's, ours. That tractor out there," he pointed with his wrench at the Steiger, "helped us keep these. A new tractor, a big shiny one with payments, could have made us lose them. It happened to a lot of good men. They forgot that you're not farming to impress your neighbors. You're farming to feed your family and to pass this land on to the next person in line. And you can't do that if you don't truly own it." He told Tom the whole story of Dale Peterson, not as a way to gloat, but as a lesson. He talked about the boom years, the easy credit, the feeling that the good times would never end. And he talked about the crash, the auctions, and the quiet desperation. "That old Steiger," Art said, patting its massive fender, "it's more than a machine, it's a promise to ourselves that we will never owe any man for the roof over our head or the ground under our feet." Tom looked from the deeds to the old tractor, and for the first time he didn't see an obsolete piece of junk. He saw a guardian, a symbol of a hard-won independence. Art climbed into the cab. "Let's see if the old girl will start," he said with a small smile. He turned the key. The starter groaned for a moment, then the big Cummins V8 caught, erupting into its deep, guttural, rhythmic roar. The sound filled the old shop, vibrating through the wooden timbers and the concrete floor. It was the sound of pure, simple, mechanical power. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a legacy, paid for in full, ready for the next season and the one after that.